Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope that you enjoyed your holiday weekend and the beautiful weather. It's been really warm and beautiful in Michigan, and especially if you were on the water, it was just a spectacular weekend. So, back to business today. Um, Today, we're going to talk about placement, and we're going to talk about placement decisions, kind of the continuum of placements. And I say kind of because there's varying degrees of agreement if there actually is a continuum or not, depending on which district you're in Michigan or what state you're in. We'll talk about least restrictive environment and what that is. And then we'll talk about children's rights who are placed by their public school district in a private school setting. So that's what we're going to review today. And so to begin, basically, what is considered a placement? A placement is any physical location that the child is moved from for more than 10 days. So there can be a change of placement if a child is suspended for more than 10 days. It can be a change of placement if a child is expelled. It can be a change of placement if they're moving from having an hour in gen ed and the rest of their day in more specialized classrooms to half and half, um, or any number of other supports, enrichments, whatever it's going to be, to provide that education. So basically, in order for the IEP team, to make a placement decision, these should be individualized. They should consider how the child learns and how the child is best taught, and they must be in writing. And the um, the requirements to place a child with disabilities in the least restrictive environment and to provide a continuum of an alternative placements. And then there are rules that help us decide what is the proper placement. If there's a disagreement between the recommendation for placement and what the parents believe is the appropriate placement, then they need to immediately notify the school, and they need to, and then if they don't get any satisfaction that way, then they can pursue the due process hearing route. Uh, Both the school and the parents or the student have a right to due process in this whole procedure that we're talking about. Um, if there is no like one size fits all placement. They can't say that, because you're autistic, you're going to be in the ASD, autism spectrum disorder um, classroom. If you're EI, you don't automatically go into the emotionally impaired classroom. It's not uncommon for many different disabilities to be contained in one classroom or to overlap into several classrooms. And the reason that that is because, again, we're trying to have the least restrictive environment for each individual child. So basically, the IDEA says that special education is a service for children rather than a place where such children are sent. When you think about placement decisions, you need to keep that in mind. And so, in looking at those decisions, the team needs to look at the services the child needs and then where those services can be provided. And again, they have to be individualized based on the needs that are defined in the IEP. When the placement decision is made, it should be made as a team. It shouldn't be one member of the team saying, this is the place, this is the only place, this is where this child needs to be. Parents are part of the team. general education teacher is part of the team because that brings in the component of the curriculum that is being given to general education students. The special education teacher is part of the team. Anyone who's done an evaluation or can interpret the results of the evaluation and look at the specific testing and understand why those tests were done is part of the team. And then a representative from any possible placement should also be there as well to describe their programs and what services can be provided or what supplementary aids can be provided within that classroom structure. So again, the disability should not define the placement unless it is the least restrictive environment using that test we just talked about. So the first thing that the team has to consider is whether or not a placement in general education is appropriate. And then they can look at if they don't believe that general education is appropriate, then they can say, well, what supplementary aids, services, and supports does this child need in order to remain in a general education classroom? And then if at that point, if they still cannot fully support the child to make the even playing field, then you run into a FAPE issue. So at that point, they're going to look at an alternative placement in order to make sure that the child gets access to all the education that is being provided in the general education classroom. So the next thing is that they look at the needs in the IEP, and they should be assessing those needs every year and looking at progress every year. And they then look at programming and that it should be, and then they try to put them in a school that has that programming in a self-contained classroom or partially self-contained, partially gen ed that's convenient and close to their home. It does not have to be close to the home. It should be where the child can best be serviced. Very important distinction. Um, Again, the IDEA is very clear. A child's placement may not be based on the child's disability or label or severity of the disability. It has to consider all of the supports, services, needs that are defined in the IEP, not just what the eligibility certification is. The school has services available not only in their own district, but in surrounding private schools, as well as in alternative districts or alternative schools in other districts. As long as it's in the same county, they pretty much can find the best place for a child to be. We talked for a second about the continuing of alternative placements. So you start with general education, and then it gets more narrow, more specific, more restrictive as you go down. However, a child needs, so the child needs to be the highest up they can be and still have all of their supports in a level playing field and access to education. So basically, when we look at the continuum of alternative placements, it's the place where the child actually receives the education services. Placements are on a continuum, as I just described, from least to most restrictive. A child's placement may be in a regular classroom, a regular class with needed supplementary aids and services, a special class where all receive special education services for some or most of the day. It could be at a special school, it could be at home, it could be in a hospital or other institution, it could be in another setting, which opens up a whole world of other settings, including private schools. So the relationship between supplementary aids and services and the placement is another thing that we need to look at. And in doing that, we're talking about direct services like one-on-one speech therapy, or one-on-one math tutoring versus indirect services where the child is in a small group, maybe 3, 4, or 5 students with either their classroom teacher, parapro, or a specialist. And so that is something to consider. Um, and so basically, modifications, as we talked about the other day, are when the assignments are changed or the regular curriculum is changed to adapt to a more manageable workload for the student. Then you have aids and services, which are, it could be anything. It could be the assistive technology. It could be recording, I guess recording lectures comes under assistive technology, getting the notes, but really you use modifications in order to access the education curriculum. And then you have assistance for the teacher through supports and special education training. And then you also have special education training for the regular education teacher. So those are three different scenarios where the supplementary aids and services come in, and what teacher it is really, as I said, physical plant where this child's going to be placed. But again, it has to be based on the individual needs of the individual child and how they learn and how they are best taught, not just the label. The IEP must include a statement of specific special education and related services to be provided, and to the extent the child will be able to participate in a regular education program. Remember, we want the least restrictive environment, so regular education must be entertained first, or general education as it's now called. General education with supports and services is the next thing that must be considered. The team has to, it's not even has, it must look at the child's unique educational needs before deciding on related services and supplementary aids and services that the child needs. Uh, the when you're dealing with placement and least restrictive environment, you need to keep in mind that the law requires schools to educate children with disabilities in a regular education class with children who are not disabled to the maximum extent possible. You remember way back in early March when we started being at home, and at that time, it was, people were like, oh, just, my child's IEP still in play? And yes, it was, because they were providing educational services to the gen ed population. They must provide the same services or the same access to education to the special education children. So, coming back to the placement decisions, if your child cannot be removed from general education classes unless the nature or severity of the disability does not allow them to learn in that educational setting. And that's what kind of kicks in. Okay, well, can they learn in that setting with supplementary aids and services? And sometimes they can and sometimes they can't. And if they can't, then we have to go down the continuum to whatever's next. A lot of times we hear people talk about inclusion. Inclusion is referencing a child a child with special needs being included in a classroom of children without special needs. Inclusion is not anywhere in the law. That is a term that has just come through life in education, and it is not contained in the IDEA, but it's used intermittently to least restrictive environment. If your child is really high functioning and the team wants to place him or her in a self-contained classroom, it's very important to look at the other children in the classroom and what the individual curriculum is in that self-contained classroom. For example, if you have a child that's very verbal and is potty trained, you don't want them placed in a classroom where most of the students are not verbal and are not potty trained, because that means part of their curriculum is going to be potty training. And if your child is already there, that may not be the appropriate place for them. If your child is verbal and maybe they can only do 3 or 4 word sentences, but they can locate their vocabulary and access it and communicate with words, then they shouldn't be in a classroom where children are only communicating with pictures. So those are just individual things that you need to look at when you're looking to see if your child is in the appropriate placement. Um, so if you object to the proposed placement, Um, you need to immediately write a letter to the school district, to whoever was the head of the team of the IEP team, the superintendent. I would CC it to all of them and state very, very specifically why you object to the proposed change. If you just say it's not the right place for my child, you're not going to get very far. Remember, when we have talked in the past, I've always said that the child is best known by their parents, because especially now you have seen them learn, you have had to teach them, you know what they can do, you know what they can't do, you know when they're having temper tantrums, you know that when the way that they like to be praised or what their love language is, you know what positive reinforcements help them to curb their behavior. And so you have the tools, you have the knowledge, you can be their superhero if you write a really specific letter. If the school refuses to change anything, then unfortunately you have to start litigation. And it doesn't always litigate in a courtroom, but it's when you have to file and request a due process for a due process hearing. And there'll then be a resolution meeting right after that complaint is filed, where the school will assemble the team and try to come to some resolution. The uh, you also at that point can write a state civil rights complaint to the Michigan Department of Education, and you can even do a federal civil rights complaint if you wish. Depending on what the issue is, will depend what uh, on what path you take at that point. Um, After you send the letter to school and to other people, the law requires specific things to happen, and further to be written notice. Remember, special ed, if it's not in writing, it doesn't count. It didn't happen. So, special written notice, and it should say the action proposed or refused by the school. It should say that it should explain why the school is proposing or refusing to take that action, describe each evaluation or procedure or assessment or observation or record or report that the schools used as a basis for the proposed or referred action. Include a statement that the parents of the child are protected under the procedural safeguard section of the law. Provide sources for parents to contact for assistance in understanding these provisions. Describe other options the IEP team considered in making their decision, and describe the factors relevant to the school's proposal or refusal. The safeguard prior written notice, um, it applies to any request for a change of placement that the parents or any other member of the team refuses to agree to. So that means that if you ask for an independent education evaluation, an IEE, and the school says no, you can file due process. You have an absolute right to one. If your child is being suspended or expelled without a manifestation hearing, you can file due process because the school has an absolute duty under the law to hold a hearing to determine that the conduct underlying the discipline is not a manifestation of the disability. If it is a manifestation of the disability, they cannot be expelled or suspended. There are other procedures that need to be followed. So due process can come in pretty much anytime there's a disagreement, but it's not always the best thing to do to run and file a due process complaint. So the last thing I want to talk about today is when children are placed by their public school district in private school. And yes, that does happen. And how does that happen? Because most private schools, although they're private, do receive federal funds. And so they would fall under the IDEA in that circumstance. And and when the district holds the IEP meeting, if a private school placement is on the table, then there should be a representative from that private entity, the same way that there's a representative from the general education classroom, or that teacher, so that they can explain the curriculum and how the child is going to access that curriculum. It's very, very important. Um, the district is responsible for providing the child with the free and appropriate public education with FAPE. So if they're placed in a private school, the public school district is still responsible that the private school implements the services, the aids, the supplements, the supports, and anything else that is needed for the child to be successful in their least restrictive environment placement, which is at the private school. And a lot of parents in that circumstance ask if they have to pay for it if it's private school, and the answer is no. That the public school that could not provide the least restrictive environment and could not provide the free and appropriate public education on its own has selected the private school as the place for this child to learn best, and the public school district has to pay for it. So that's just really important to consider. So with that discussion of placement, we will wrap up for today. Tomorrow we will be back at 1 o'clock, and we are going to talk about reviewing and revising your IEP and what that looks like. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day, and stay happy, stay healthy, and I will see you tomorrow.